$2 million, 11 experts, 4 years of silence from one of the most legendary engines ever built. And not a single man with a six-figure reputation could tell Victoria Sterling why. They tore the car apart, they rebuilt it, they charged her fortunes and handed back excuses dressed up as diagnosis. Then a woman who had built an empire on trusting the wrong people made one last desperate decision. She called a mechanic nobody had ever heard of. Cole Bennett showed up in work boots with a cracked sole, looked at the car for 4 minutes, and asked one question that stopped the room cold. What happened next would unravel everything. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Lamborghini Miura sat in the center of the climate-controlled garage like something that had been placed there by people who understood what reverence meant. It was a 1971 SV, the final and most refined iteration of a car that had rewritten what the word beautiful could mean when applied to machinery. The body was painted in a shade called verde metallizzata, a deep metallic green that shifted between forest and jade depending on where the light fell. And even after 4 years of sitting idle, it still held a presence that made people stop talking when they walked through the door. The leather inside was original. The gauges behind the steering wheel were original. Even the small oval mirror mounted above the instrument cluster, a detail so easily overlooked that most restoration specialists never noticed it, was the same mirror that had been bolted in at the Sant'Agata factory more than 50 years ago. Victoria Sterling had paid $3.2 million for the car at auction 7 years ago, and she had never once regretted it. Not the price, not the storage fees, not the insurance premiums that made her accountant wince twice a year. She had grown up in a house where her father kept a framed photograph of a Miura on his office wall, not because he could afford one, not even because he particularly understood cars, but because he said it was the only machine he'd ever seen that looked like it was moving even when it was standing still. She had bought the car the week after he died, and she had never told anyone that. What she regretted, what had been grinding against her for 4 years with the persistence of sand in a gear, was the silence. The car had stopped running on a Thursday night in October 4 years ago. There had been no warning, no knocking, no rough idle, no hesitation in the throttle response that might have suggested something building toward failure. She had driven it that afternoon along the private road that wound around the rear of the estate, windows down, the V12 behind her singing in that particular register that always made her feel like the world had briefly agreed to be exactly what it was supposed to be. She had parked it, walked inside, had dinner, gone to bed. And in the morning, when Marcus, her estate manager at the time, had gone to move it for a scheduled detailing appointment, it would not start. Not a cough, not a turnover, nothing. And so began what Victoria later came to think of as the years of the experts. The first man they called was Enrique Voss, a Portuguese-born restoration specialist who worked out of a facility in Stuttgart and whose waiting list ran to 18 months. Voss arrived with 2 assistants, a set of diagnostic equipment that he'd had custom-built for pre-1980 Italian exotics, and a manner that communicated without him ever quite saying so directly that he expected to be listened to. He spent 11 days with the car. His conclusion was that the fuel delivery system had experienced a cascading failure originating from degraded injector seals, a diagnosis that he delivered with such technical precision and such absolute confidence that Victoria had simply nodded and signed the estimate. The repair took 6 weeks and cost $240,000. The car still would not start. Voss, when called back, attributed this to a secondary failure that the original problem had masked. Common in vehicles of this vintage, he explained. Damaged components could hide behind the symptoms of other damaged components, the way one injury could make a person compensate until they'd torn something else entirely. He was not wrong, technically. He was also not helpful. He submitted a second estimate. Victoria paid it. He returned, spent another 2 weeks, and ultimately concluded that there was a deeper electrical issue that he was not equipped to fully diagnose, and suggested she contact a specialist he knew in Milan. She did not contact the specialist in Milan. She contacted 4 other people first. Ewan Calloway out of Edinburgh, who had a reputation for diagnosing electrical gremlins in vintage Italian cars that no one else could locate. He found 3 separate wiring issues and corrected all of them at a combined cost of just over $300,000. The car still would not start. Dr. Petra Mans, a German engineer who had spent 15 years working for a museum that specialized in automotive preservation, who concluded that the issue was almost certainly in the carburetor assembly, except that the Miura SV used fuel injection, a fact that Victoria's assistant Renata pointed out politely, and which Mans brushed aside before eventually acknowledging and resubmitting a revised diagnosis involving the fuel pressure regulator. The work she performed cost $180,000. The car still would not start. A man named Theodore Ash, who operated a restoration shop in Connecticut and who had been profiled in 3 separate automotive publications, who spent 3 weeks disassembling the rear mid-engine section entirely and rebuilding it from components he sourced from a parts specialist in Modena. His bill came to just over $400,000. The car started once, ran for approximately 40 seconds, settled into a rough idle for perhaps 15 more, and then stopped. It never started again after that. Theodore Ash told Victoria that the brief start proved his work had been sound, and that the persistent issue was almost certainly elsewhere in the system. She had, at some point in the second year, stopped being angry about it. Anger required a kind of energy that she preferred to redirect toward the company she ran, Sterling Capital Group, an asset management firm she had built over 20 years into something that managed just north of $4 billion in client assets. She was not sentimental about money. She had earned enough of it to understand that it was a tool, and like most tools, it was most useful when you didn't think too much about it. What bothered her about the Miura situation was not the money. It was the pattern she was seeing, which was a pattern she recognized from her professional life. The way that certainty and competence were frequently mistaken for each other, and the way that the people most willing to declare themselves experts were often the people most insulated from the consequences of being wrong. By the time she reached expert number 8, she had stopped asking for credentials. She started asking for references from people who had actually paid bills rather than from publications that had printed profiles. None of it helped. By the time she reached expert number 11, a man named Victor Carrasco, who had worked for a Lamborghini dealer for 20 years and who came highly recommended by 3 of her board members, Victoria had spent a cumulative total of $1,940,000 on a car that still sat in her garage in the same silence it had settled into on that Thursday night 4 years ago. Carrasco's diagnosis, delivered after 6 days of examination, was that the engine had suffered irreversible internal damage of a nature that he could document but not fully explain, and that the most responsible path forward was either a complete engine replacement, which he estimated at $700,000 using period-correct components sourced from surviving parts cars, or accepting that the vehicle was now best regarded as a static display piece. Victoria had listened to this without any visible reaction, thanked him for his time, written the check for his consultation fee, and then sat alone in her garage for almost an hour after he left. She was 53 years old. She had spent her adult life developing an instinct for when she was being told something true versus when she was being told something convenient. She could not have articulated precisely what it was that made Carrasco's conclusion feel wrong to her. Wrong in a specific way, not just disappointing, but the feeling was clear and steady, like a compass needle that wouldn't be argued with. She went back inside and found Renata. "I need you to find me a mechanic," she said. "Not a specialist, not a restoration expert, not someone with a waiting list or a magazine profile. Find me someone who actually works on cars." Renata looked at her with the expression she sometimes wore when she was deciding whether a request was worth questioning. "What kind of mechanic?" "The kind that gets their hands dirty," Victoria said. "The kind that fixes things." The name Cole Bennett came back to her 2 days later via a handwritten note from her driver, a man named Philip, who had worked for her for 9 years and who she had learned to trust not because he was warm or easy to talk to, but because he had never, not once in 9 years, told her something that wasn't true. Philip had written, "Bennett's Garage, Kellner Street, East District. Cole Bennett, owner. Fixed my truck twice when nobody else could. Doesn't advertise. Doesn't talk much either." Victoria had Renata call the number listed in the city directory. Cole Bennett answered on the 4th ring. He sounded distracted. She could hear something metallic in the background, the specific quality of noise that comes from a working shop. And when Renata explained what Victoria was asking for, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be noticeable. "A Miura," he said. Not a question. More like he was repeating it to be sure. "A 1971 SV. She'd like you to come take a look at it." Another silence. "I don't do restoration work." Mrs. Sterling isn't asking for restoration work. She's asking for a diagnosis. "There's been 11 experts already. That's what her assistant told you to tell me?" Renata paused, looked at Victoria, who nodded. "Yes. 11 specialists over 4 years, none of them could get it running." The silence this time was shorter. "What's she paying?" Renata looked at Victoria again. Victoria held up 4 fingers. $4,000 for the consultation, Renata said, regardless of outcome. There was a long pause. The metallic sounds in the background shifted, something being set down on a concrete floor. "All right," Cole Bennett said. "Tell her Saturday morning, and tell her I need to be left alone with it." He arrived at 7:45 on a Saturday morning in a truck that was old enough to have been through things. It was a pickup, the kind that had started out a specific color and had arrived somewhere between rust and brown over the intervening years. And it had a toolbox mounted in the bed that was locked with a padlock that had seen better decades. He was 38 years old, medium height, built the way people get built when they do physical work for 20 years rather than going to a gym. His hands were the kind of hands you noticed, large, with the particular weathered quality of skin that has been cleaned of grease so many times that the cleaning itself has become part of the texture. He was wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt under an open flannel. He had a coffee thermos in one hand. He looked at the house as he walked from the truck, not with awe exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who notices things. Renata met him at the side entrance to the garage. He nodded at her without saying much, declined the offer of coffee since he already had his own, and then walked into the garage and stopped. For a moment he just stood there, looked at the Miura the way you look at something that you've read about but never actually been in the same room with. The verde metallizada body caught the garage's overhead light and held it in that particular way it had, the green deepening around the curves of the rear haunches, the long nose stretching forward like an accusation. Cole set his thermos down on the workbench along the far wall. He walked around the car once, slowly. Didn't touch it, just looked. He crouched at the rear to study the engine compartment access. The Miura's V12 sat transversely amidships, accessible through a hinged panel above and behind the seats, and stayed low for a while, eyes moving across the surface details with an attention that was quiet and deliberate. Then he walked back around to the driver's side and opened the door. He did not get in. He stood with the door open and looked at the cockpit, the gauges, the steering column, the center console. He looked for about 30 seconds. Then he closed the door again, gently, the way you close a door when you are conscious of what's on the other side. He picked up his thermos, took a drink, and stood there for another long moment. Victoria was watching from the far end of the garage, by the door that led into the main house. She had intended to stay away. She had told Renata she was going to stay away, but she had lasted approximately 12 minutes before coming to stand in the doorway. She recognized the impulse as the same one that made her stay late at the office when something important was being decided. She didn't like to wait elsewhere for things that mattered. Cole hadn't seemed to notice her yet. He was looking at the car again, specifically at the driver's side footwell, leaning in slightly through the open window without putting his weight on the door. Then he straightened up and turned around and saw her. He didn't seem surprised. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the house, with attention, but without performance. "Mrs. Sterling," he said. "Mr. Bennett." She moved a few steps into the garage. "I was told you wanted to be left alone." "I did," he said. "I've been alone." He glanced toward the far corner of the garage at nothing in particular. Who's had access to this space since the car stopped running? She hadn't been expecting a question. She'd been expecting a preliminary assessment, or at least something that gestured toward one. "Access to the garage?" "Yeah, regular access." "Who's been in and out over the past 4 years?" Victoria thought about it. "The specialists, obviously. Their assistants. Marcus. My estate manager. He's no longer employed here. His replacement, Helen. Renata. She paused. My driver, Philip. Security staff. Cole nodded slowly. His eyes had gone back to the car. These 11 specialists who looked at it, any of them asked about who'd been in the garage? No. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the sound a person makes when something confirms a suspicion they'd already formed. Okay. He picked up his thermos. Can I ask you something? That's what you're here for. He looked at her directly. He had the kind of eyes that didn't add anything. They just received. The night the car stopped running, the night before it stopped, I mean, was there anybody in this garage who shouldn't have been? The question landed differently than she expected, not because she didn't have an answer, but because no one had ever asked it before. 11 specialists, 4 years, nearly $2 million, and not one person had walked into this garage and thought to ask whether the problem might have had a starting point that wasn't inside the engine. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the Miura. There might have been, she said carefully. Why? Cole Bennett took another drink from his thermos. He seemed to be organizing something internally, deciding where to start. Because the car's not broken, he said. The words sat in the air of the garage with the specific weight of things that are both simple and enormous. I'm sorry, Victoria said. The engine, he said. The mechanical components. Everything I can see from here. Nothing's wrong with them. He nodded at the car. Something stopped it from running, but I don't think it was anything that failed. Victoria was quiet for a moment. In her professional life, she had learned that silence, deployed correctly, was one of the most effective tools available to a person who wanted to understand something. She waited. When you open the door, Cole said, and you look at the cockpit, the way the dust has settled, the gauges, the pedals, the seat position, he paused. Everything is exactly the way it'd be if someone just parked it and walked away. No sign that anybody who actually tried to diagnose a mechanical failure ever went looking in the right place. He looked at her again. All those specialists, they went straight to the engine, every one of them. That's where the problem usually is, she said. It wasn't an argument. She was genuinely thinking aloud. Yeah, Cole said. That's what they counted on. The garage was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, a bird was working through a short, repetitive call. Who, Victoria said slowly, is they? Cole set his thermos back on the workbench and walked toward the car. Let me get under the dash for a minute, he said, and then let's you and me have a real conversation. I'd sent. He was under the dashboard for 4 minutes. Victoria stood beside the car and listened to the small sounds he made, the quiet movement of a professional working in a tight space, the occasional metallic whisper of a tool being selected and applied. She had a complicated feeling she couldn't fully name, something between hope and the specific dread of someone who has been wrong before and is approaching the possibility of being wrong again from a different direction. When Cole slid back out and stood up, he was holding something between 2 fingers. It was small, rectangular, translucent yellow plastic, the kind of thing you might not even see if it weren't being held up deliberately. It was perhaps 1 inch long and a 1/2 inch wide. It looked like nothing. Fuse, he said. Victoria looked at it. That's a fuse. Main circuit fuse for the ignition system. Without it, the car won't do anything, won't turn over, won't even try. He held it up slightly, as if she might want a better look. It's missing. Has been missing probably since the night the car stopped running. He paused. It wasn't blown out. Fuses blow when there's too much current. They melt, they burn. This socket's clean. The fuse was pulled. The words sat between them. Pulled. Someone removed it, Victoria said. The flatness in her voice was the sound of a person bringing enormous discipline to bear on an enormous reaction. Deliberately, Cole said. Yeah. And that's why the car won't start. That's the only reason the car won't start. He looked at the fuse again, then set it carefully on the workbench. Replace it with the right component. Standard automotive fuse costs about $8, $9 at any parts shop, and this car runs. All those repairs those specialists did, some of them probably fixed real problems. Old car, sitting 4 years, things degrade. But none of it was why it stopped. It stopped because somebody pulled a fuse. Victoria was still looking at the fuse on the workbench. It was so small. It was so completely, devastatingly small. "How long," she said, "before you saw it?" Cole thought about it honestly. "I started wondering about it pretty much right when I walked in. The car looked too good. Cars that have suffered major mechanical failures, they look like they've been through something. This one looked like it was just waiting." 4 minutes, Victoria said. "You were here 4 minutes." "About that." She turned away from the workbench and looked at the Miura, at the Verde Metallizada body, the exact color her father had loved in that photograph on his office wall, the car that had sung to her on a fall afternoon and then gone silent and stayed silent while she spent 2 years' worth of other people's careful savings trying to understand why. "Someone pulled a fuse," she said, "and 11 experts, and nearly $2 million, and 4 years. None of them looked," Cole said. "They all had the same assumption going in. Big problem with a legendary engine must be deep in the mechanicals. You start looking for complicated answers, you stop seeing simple ones." Victoria turned back around. Her face was controlled, but not entirely. There was something moving behind her eyes that was not quite grief and not quite rage, and was probably the specific form of devastation that arrives when you understand, all at once, the full shape of something you've been living inside without being able to see it. "You said they counted on it," she said. "Before. When I asked where the problem usually is, you said that's what they counted on." Cole met her eyes. "Yes. You already know it wasn't an accident." "I think you already know that too," he said quietly. "And I think part of the reason you called someone like me instead of specialist number 12 is because you were starting to wonder if the problem was never in the engine at all." The garage was very quiet again. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, at this man in his worn flannel and his cracked work boots, holding a coffee thermos in a garage that had probably consumed more money in 4 years than his business had seen in its entire existence. She thought about Henrika Voss and his custom diagnostic equipment. She thought about Theodore Ash and his sourced from Modena components. She thought about Victor Carrasco telling her with grave professional certainty that the most responsible path forward was to treat the car as a static display piece. She thought about the fuse on the workbench. $8 or $9. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I think you and I need to look at some security footage." Cole picked up his thermos. "Yeah," he said, "I think we do." The security system at the Sterling estate was not ornamental. Victoria had put serious money into it 7 years ago, when the company hit a threshold where the gap between what she was worth and what someone might be willing to do about it had become a professional concern rather than a theoretical one. 12 cameras covered the exterior. 8 covered interior spaces, including the garage. All footage was stored on a local server as well as backed up to an off-site facility, and the retention period was 18 months on the local copy and 5 years on the backup. 4 years of footage existed. A lot of it. Victoria had Renata pull the backup files for the 48-hour window surrounding the night the car had stopped running, the evening before, the night itself, and the following morning. She and Cole sat at the security workstation in the small monitoring room adjacent to the main garage, a space that smelled of climate control and old coffee, and the particular dry cold of rooms kept at temperatures optimized for equipment rather than people. They watched in silence, mostly. The garage camera from that night was mounted high in the northwest corner, covering the full floor space with a slight fisheye distortion. The timestamp showed the afternoon clearly, Victoria's own arrival, the brief drive of the Miura out and back along the private road, the return to the garage, her departure into the house. The car sat there in the empty garage through the early evening hours, the overhead lights cycling off on their timer at 9:15 p.m., after which the footage shifted to the faint green cast of the infrared mode. At 11:47 p.m., the garage side door opened. Cole leaned forward slightly, said nothing. The figure that came through the door was identifiable even in the infrared quality of the footage. He moved with the specific confidence of someone who knows they belong in a space. Not cautious, not rushing, just purposeful. He went directly to the Miura. He stood beside the driver's door for a moment, then opened it, leaned in across the cockpit and reached under the dashboard. He was there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he straightened up, closed the door, and walked back out the way he'd come. Total time in the garage, less than 2 minutes. Victoria did not say anything for a long moment after the door closed on the footage. The timestamp read 11:49 p.m. "Marcus," she said. The name came out flat and clean, like something put down. "Your estate manager," Cole said. He wasn't asking. "My estate manager." She reached out and paused the footage. He had full access to this space. Alarm codes, keys, everything. She sat back. "He left my employ 14 months ago. I was told the separation was amicable. His performance review the previous year had been..." She paused, and something flickered across her face. A person processing a memory in new light. "Adequate." I said adequate. He knew I was not satisfied. "But you didn't fire him." "I gave him time to improve. It's how I prefer to operate." She looked at the frozen image on the monitor, the empty garage, the Lamborghini sitting in infrared green. He resigned. He said he'd received an offer elsewhere that he couldn't decline. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Elsewhere," he said. "Meaning where?" Victoria looked at him. "Because," Cole said carefully, "the fuse doesn't explain $2 million worth of repairs. Somebody had to direct those specialists. Somebody had to know who to call, what to suggest they look for, how to keep the diagnosis pointing away from anything simple." He paused. "Marcus let himself in here and pulled a fuse. But what happened after that, the years of expensive misdirection, that's a different operation. That's not something an estate manager engineers alone." The monitoring room felt very small suddenly. The climate control hummed. "What are you suggesting?" Victoria said, though her voice suggested she already had a shape for it. "I'm suggesting," Cole said carefully, "that somebody who stood to benefit from those repair bills, somebody who was in a position to recommend specialists and sign off on estimates and manage the process, maybe also needed the car to stay broken." He looked at her directly. "Who had that kind of authority over this project?" Victoria turned back to the monitor. She reached out and hit play again. The empty garage, the Miura in the infrared dark. "Those specialists were all engaged through my company's operations office," she said slowly. "Not through my personal staff. My CFO handled the oversight after the first two. I turned it over to him because I didn't want to manage it myself. I had other things to focus on." "Your CFO," Cole said. "Damian Cross," Victoria said, and the way she said the name was the way you say the name of something you're still measuring, still turning in your hands, checking its weight, deciding whether you're holding what you think you're holding. He recommended specialists? Several of them. Theodore Ashe, specifically, and Victor Carrasco. She was quiet for a moment. Damien also managed the contractor relationships for those repairs. The payments went through his office. Cole didn't push it. He just let the space do what spaces do when the person in them is working something out. Victoria sat very still at the monitor station. Outside, through the building's walls, the morning had continued becoming itself. Warmer now, the sun higher, the kind of light that makes everything look ordinary. She was thinking about Damian Cross. She had worked with him for 11 years. He had been at her company since before it had been the kind of company it was now, back when it was a firm of 12 people operating out of leased office space in a building with a perpetually broken elevator. He had a wife he talked about occasionally, and 2 kids he talked about less. He had a nervous laugh that surfaced whenever he was in the presence of a decision that frightened him. She thought about the repair bills. $180,000, $300,000, $400,000. The money flowing through his office, the contractors he'd selected, the specialists he'd recommended. She thought about the fuse, that small, translucent rectangle sitting on the workbench in the next room, and the gap between its cost and the cost of everything that had followed from its removal. She thought about what kind of person could stand in the same room as her for 11 years and build something like that. "I need to look at some financial records," she said. "I think that'd be a good idea," Cole said. She stood up. She was very controlled. That was always the first thing you noticed about Victoria Sterling, the control. But underneath it, something had shifted in the last 90 minutes in a way that would take time to fully register. She'd walked into the garage this morning expecting, at best, one more piece of disappointing news. She was walking out of this room with something else entirely. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "thank you for what you've done this morning." Cole stood as well, picking up his thermos. "I haven't done anything yet," he said. "The car's not running." "No," she agreed, "but now I know why it isn't." He nodded slowly. Something moved across his face. Not quite discomfort, but close to it. The look of someone who has opened a door and is thinking about what might come through it. "Mrs. Sterling, whatever you find in those records, be careful how you move on it. If somebody built this over 4 years, they planned it. They're going to have moves ready." Victoria looked at him for a moment. "You're worried about me." "I'm worried about what happens when people who've built something like this feel it's starting to come apart," he said simply. "They don't usually just stand there and wait for it." She held his gaze for a moment. "I've been in rooms with dangerous people before, Mr. Bennett. It's part of the business I'm in." "Dangerous in a boardroom and dangerous when they're backed into a corner," Cole said, "aren't necessarily the same thing." She considered that. Then she picked up the coffee cup she'd set aside when they'd sat down to watch the footage, found it cold, set it back down. "I'll be careful," she said. "But I'm also not going to pretend I haven't seen what I've seen." Cole nodded. He looked at the frozen garage footage on the monitor one more time. The car, the empty space, the infrared dark. "The fuse," he said. "I can get the replacement today, standard component. I'll have it in my truck, or I can stop at a parts place on the way home." He paused. "You want me to hold off until you've looked at the records? The car starting might be significant, depending on what you find." Victoria thought about it. "Hold off," she said, "but don't go far." "I'm not going anywhere," Cole said. He said it like a simple fact, the way he said most things, without elaboration, without performance. But it landed differently than a simple fact, in that room, in that morning, with everything that had just shifted. Victoria walked back through the door into the main garage. The Miura sat exactly as it always did. Still, patient, verde metallizada, waiting for something that was finally coming. She stood beside it for a moment, put her hand on the roof gently. Then she went inside to look at the money. The financial records for Sterling Capital Group's operations division were stored across 3 separate systems. The internal accounting platform, a project management archive that Damien's office had maintained independently, and the backup documentation that the company's external auditors required to be retained for 7 years. Renata knew how to access all 3. She had been Victoria's executive assistant for 6 years, and one of the things Victoria valued most about her was that she did not ask unnecessary questions about why she was being asked to do things. By early afternoon, Renata had pulled everything related to the Miura restoration project and arranged it chronologically in a series of folders on Victoria's private workstation. She brought coffee without being asked, set it beside the keyboard, and left the room without saying anything. Victoria sat down and started reading. She had spent her professional life reading financial documents, contracts, audit reports, investment disclosures, balance sheets from companies that were trying to look healthier than they were. She had a specific skill for it, not just following the numbers, but feeling the shape of them, the way a sculptor might run a hand across stone and find the flaw before they could see it. It was not a skill she'd been taught. It was something that had developed through years of being in rooms where people were trying to use numbers to tell a story that wasn't quite true. The Miura records told her a story within the first 40 minutes. The total paid to outside specialists over 4 years came to $1,940,000, exactly as she'd known. What she hadn't known, what no one had shown her, because no one had arranged it this way before, was where that money had actually gone. The checks had been written to the specialists themselves, yes, but running parallel to those payments, buried in a budget line labeled Operational Consultation, Automotive Heritage Asset, was a second stream of payments, smaller, irregular, going to 3 different companies whose names she didn't recognize. She wrote the names down on a notepad. Velant Consulting LLC, Marbridge Asset Services. The third one was listed only by a tax identification number with no business name attached. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Outside the window, the afternoon had gone flat and white, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between clearing and closing in. She picked up her phone and called her legal counsel, A woman named Patricia Owens, who had handled Sterling Capital's legal affairs for 9 years, and who answered on the second ring even on a Saturday. "I need you to run some corporate registrations for me," Victoria said. "3 entities. I'll send you the names." "This afternoon?" Patricia said. "This afternoon." A brief pause. "All right. Give me a couple of hours." Victoria sent the names, then went back to the records. She started pulling the individual contracts for each repair engagement, the full documents, not the summaries that had come through her office at the time. Some of them she had signed. Most she hadn't. Most had been authorized by Damien under the Operational Expenditure Authority she'd given him 8 years ago, a delegated signing authority that she reviewed annually and had never had reason to revisit. She was on her 3rd contract when she found the markup. Theodore Ash's final bill for the engine disassembly and rebuild had been $412,000. The original contract, signed by Damien, specified a scope of work and a ceiling of $380,000. The final invoice was $32,000 over that ceiling. There was no change order, no documented approval of the overage, just the invoice, paid in full, 3 days after it was submitted. She checked the others. Enrique Voss's second engagement billed $23,000 over the approved ceiling. Ewan Calloway, $14,000 over. Petra Mans. The bill matched the contract exactly, which Victoria stared at for a moment before she understood. Mans had been the one who'd initially misidentified the fuel system, the embarrassment of which had probably made her less willing to push for more than she was owed. Each overage was individually small enough to fall within the range of things that got approved in review without close attention. Cumulatively, across all 11 engagements, the overages totaled just over $118,000. All of it had flowed through Damien's office. None of it had a paper trail that connected it back to any approved change in scope. Victoria sat with that for a long time. Then Patricia called back. "Valant Consulting LLC," Patricia said without preamble. "Registered in Delaware 18 months before the first Miura repair engagement. Single member LLC. The registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington that I've seen before. They do a lot of shell work." A pause. "The member of record is not a name you're going to like." Victoria said nothing. Waited. "Marcus Henley," Patricia said. "Your former estate manager." The room was very quiet. "Marbridge Asset Services," Patricia continued. "Also Delaware. Also a single-member LLC, different registered agent. This one took me a bit longer." Another pause. "The member of record here is listed as an individual named Cross, middle initial D. The registration address is a mailbox facility in the financial district." Victoria put the pen down on the notepad very deliberately. "Damien Cross," she said. It wasn't a question, but she needed to say it. "Damien Cross," Patricia confirmed. "And the third entity, the one with only a tax ID, that one is going to take longer to unravel. But based on the structure of the other two, I'd be surprised if it doesn't connect back to one of them." Victoria looked at the folders spread across her workstation. The 4 years of documents, the contracts, and the invoices, and the quiet little payments to entities whose names meant nothing until you knew where to look. "Patricia," she said, "I need you to find me someone who does forensic accounting. Someone who isn't connected to this company and who can be available starting Monday." "I can have a name to you within the hour," Patricia said. "Good." Victoria paused. "Don't say anything to anyone about this conversation. Not yet." "Understood," Patricia said. And then, because she was Patricia and had known Victoria long enough, "How bad is it?" Victoria looked at the markup on Theodore Ash's invoice, the $32,000 that nobody had noticed because it was a small number on a large bill. "I don't know the full shape of it yet," she said, "but it's been running for at least 4 years, and it was designed by someone who knew how I operated." She hung up. She sat in the chair for a moment, not doing anything. The coffee Renata had brought was cold. She thought about the nervous laugh, the way Damien Cross laughed when he was in the presence of a decision that frightened him. She thought about 11 years of meetings, of quarterly reviews, of the particular dynamic that develops between a person who builds something and the person who manages the money that building it requires. She had trusted him not because she was naive, she was emphatically not naive, but because trust, in her experience, was a working hypothesis you tested continuously and revised when the evidence required it. She had never had evidence that required revising it. Until now, she'd never known what evidence to look for. She stood up, rolled her neck once, a habit from long days at her desk, and went to find Cole Bennett. He was in the garage. She hadn't asked him to stay, but she wasn't surprised that he had. He was sitting on a wooden stool he'd found somewhere, drinking from his thermos and looking at the Miura with the particular quality of attention that she was starting to recognize as just how he looked at things. He wasn't romanticizing the car. He wasn't performing appreciation. He was just looking at it the way you look at something you're responsible for, in whatever sense that had become true for him over the course of a Saturday. He heard her come in and turned. She must have looked different than she had that morning. She suspected she did, because something shifted in his face when he saw her. "You found something," he said. "Several things." She leaned against the workbench across from him. "Marcus, my former estate manager, was receiving payments from the repair engagements. He had a shell company set up 18 months before the car stopped running." Cole was quiet for a moment. 18 months before. "Yes." "So the fuse wasn't impulsive," he said. "He was already in position when he pulled it, already had somewhere for the money to go." And Damian Cross had his own entity, separate from Marcus's, but both receiving payments from the operations budget that ran through his office. She paused. "There are also overages. Every specialist bill came in above the approved contract amount, not by enough to trigger automatic review, just enough." Cole set down his thermos on the concrete floor. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands for a moment. "So Marcus disabled the car. Cross managed the response, picked the specialists, structured the contracts, made sure the repairs were expensive and inconclusive, both of them pulling money out of it the whole time. That's how it looks. And the specialists themselves? I don't know yet. Some of them may have been legitimate, bad diagnoses, genuinely fooled by a car that had nothing wrong with its mechanics. Others, she considered it. A few of the recommendations came through channels that I'm now looking at more carefully." Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed somewhere on the private road, its tires on gravel making a sound like static. 4 years, he said. "That's a long time to keep something running." "It is," Victoria said, "which means there's more to find than what I've seen so far. Whatever they built, it didn't stop at the Miura." The statement sat between them with the particular weight of something that is probably true, and that you'd still rather turn out to be wrong about. "The company's finances," Cole said. "I'm bringing in a forensic accountant Monday morning." She looked at the car. "But yes, if Damian Cross had the access and the nerve to run this for 4 years on one asset, the reasonable assumption is that the Miura was either practice or one piece of something larger." Cole picked up his thermos again. He seemed to be turning something over, deciding whether to say it. "What?" Victoria said. "Nothing that helps," he said. "Say it anyway." He looked at her. "I'm just thinking about the timing. The setup started 18 months before the car stopped running. That means somebody, Marcus or Cross, or both of them together, was watching your company and your finances for a long time before they moved. They didn't pick the Miura randomly. They picked it because it was the most expensive thing you owned that was hardest to understand from the outside." Victoria said nothing. "They knew you'd throw money at it," Cole continued, not unkindly. "They knew it mattered to you in a way that was different from business assets. Something that personal, something that costly. You'd keep trying. You'd bring in expert after expert and pay whatever they asked because stopping felt like giving up on something that wasn't just a car." Victoria looked at the Miura for a long moment, at the curve of its roof in the garage light. "You're saying they understood me well enough to plan around my attachment to it," she said. "I'm saying whoever designed this knew you," Cole said. "Not just your company, you." That was the thing that hurt, Victoria realized. Not the money. Not even the years. It was the intimacy of it, the specific knowledge it required. The way you'd have to know a person to build a trap that fit exactly around the shape of what they loved. Damian Cross has worked for me for 11 years, she said. Cole nodded. Didn't say anything else about it. There wasn't anything useful to say. She went back inside and spent the rest of the afternoon at her workstation, pulling threads. Renata stayed without being asked, bringing food at some point, a plate that sat largely untouched, and answering emails from Victoria's public calendar that needed responses so that nothing appeared out of the ordinary on Monday morning. What Victoria was looking for now was different from the Miura records. She was looking at the company's broader operational spending over the past 4 years. Vendor contracts, consultant engagements, any budget line that ran through Damian Cross's authorization and that looked, on close examination, like it might have a similar structure to what she'd found in the automotive heritage file. She found 4 more. They were in different categories: facilities management, technology infrastructure, one labeled as due diligence support for an acquisition that had ultimately not proceeded. Each one involved outside vendors whose contracts had been managed through Damian's office. Each one had a pattern of small overages that fell within administrative approval thresholds. Each one showed payments to entities that, when she ran them through Patricia's quick lookup process late in the afternoon, turned out to have the same kind of Delaware single-member structure as the ones already identified. The total, across all 5 categories, including the Miura, was not yet calculable. She didn't have everything, but the outline was visible now, the full shape of it, or most of it, and it was significantly larger than what the Miura alone had suggested. She was looking at a systematic diversion of company funds over multiple years, millions of dollars, built carefully, moved quietly, through channels that were individually defensible and collectively damning. At 7 p.m., she called Patricia again. Monday, she said. Not just the forensic accountant. I need someone who handles corporate fraud matters. Litigation experience, someone who's worked with law enforcement on financial cases. I know the right person, Patricia said, carefully. Victoria, you're certain about this? I found 5 separate schemes, not 5 separate errors. 5 schemes with the same structure, all running through the same executive. A long pause. All right, Patricia said. I'll have the team together for Monday. Early, Victoria said. Before the markets open. Early, Patricia agreed. After she hung up, Victoria sat for a moment with the quiet of the house around her. The evening had come in while she wasn't paying attention, the windows going dark, the lights in the room making the night outside look like a wall. She thought about what Cole had said, about the people who build things and how they behave when they feel them starting to come apart. Damian Cross had been at his desk on Friday, 2 days ago. He had sent her 3 emails, she could see them in her inbox from here, about routine matters. Quarterly reports, a client meeting scheduled for next week, a lunch he was trying to reschedule. Normal correspondence from a man who, as far as he knew, was still operating inside a structure he controlled. He didn't know about Saturday morning yet. He didn't know about Cole Bennett or the fuse or the footage from 4 years ago. He didn't know she'd spent today following his money. She needed it to stay that way until Monday. She stood, stretched, and went back to the garage. Cole was still there. He had, at some point in the afternoon, done something she hadn't asked him to do. He'd found a soft cloth in the supply cabinet along the far wall and cleaned the driver's side window of the Miura, which had accumulated a fine layer of dust from 4 years of climate-controlled air. Just the one window. He hadn't touched anything else. But the glass was clear now, and through it the original leather of the cockpit was visible in the evening light, worn in the specific places that leather wears when a car has been driven the way this one was driven when it was young. He was sitting on the stool again. He looked up when she came in. Worse than you thought? He asked. Bigger, she said. The Miura was one piece of it. There are others. Cole said nothing for a moment. Are you going to be all right tonight? She looked at him. The question surprised her slightly, not because it was intrusive, but because it was so direct. Most people in her professional circle asked variations of that question as formality. Cole Bennett asked it the way he looked at things, like he actually wanted to know. I'll be fine, she said. And then, because he'd earned at least the partial truth, I'm not in danger, not physically. And the anger is... She paused, finding the honest word. clarifying, rather than destabilizing. Good, he said. Anger's useful if you don't let it make you move too fast. I have no intention of moving too fast, she said. I intend to be very sure of everything before I move at all. He nodded, stood up, picked up his thermos, empty by now, she assumed, and his jacket from where he'd hung it over the side mirror of the Miura's door. The fuse, he said. You still want me to wait? She looked at the car, at the verde metallizzata body, green and patient in the evening light, at the window Cole had cleaned, the leather interior visible through it. Wait, she said, but soon. I want Damien Cross to hear that engine start. Something shifted in Cole's expression. Not a smile exactly, but something in the neighborhood of one. The kind of expression a person makes when they recognize that the person in front of them has the measure of a situation. I'll be ready when you are, he said. He picked up his stool, returned it to the corner where he'd found it, and walked toward the side door. He paused with his hand on it. Mrs. Sterling? She looked up. You're going to want to get ahead of this with your board, he said, before it gets to them another way. People like Cross, they've usually thought about their exit. They'll have a story ready. He paused. The truth is going to sound less believable than a $9 fuse should be able to sound. She looked at him. The thing about Cole Bennett, she was noticing, was that he had a particular quality of going directly to the relevant thing without decoration. It was not a skill most people had. Most people arrived at the relevant thing eventually, after they'd said a number of other things. Cole seemed to have already discarded the other things before he opened his mouth. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and walked out. The garage door swung closed behind him, and she heard the sound of his truck's engine a moment later. A sound that was, she thought, very different from the sound of the Miura's V12, but that had its own particular honesty. Something that had been through things. Something that still ran. She stood alone in the garage with the Lamborghini for a moment. Then she took out her phone and sent a message to Renata. Monday morning, 7 a.m. My office, full board notification prepared. Do not send yet, and flag anything from Damien Cross's email domain that comes in over the weekend. Forward to me directly. Don't archive. Renata's response came back in under a minute. Understood. Done. Victoria put her phone away and looked at the Miura one more time. She thought about the fuse on the workbench. She'd moved it to a small evidence bag, on Patricia's advice, to preserve it properly. $8 or $9 of translucent plastic. The thing that Damien Cross and Marcus Henley had counted on no one ever finding. They had counted on the same thing that every fraud counts on, when you stripped away the complexity, the assumption that the people around you will look where you point them, that they will accept the framework you provide because it's easier than building a new one from scratch, that they will spend millions chasing the answer you've hidden for them, and never stop to ask whether the question itself was a lie. She walked to the workbench and picked up the evidence bag, held it up to the overhead light. The fuse inside was intact, undamaged, the kind of thing you'd throw away without thinking. She set it back down carefully. Tomorrow was Sunday. She would let Sunday be quiet. She would let Damien Cross send his routine emails and reschedule his lunch, and believe that Monday morning was going to be like other Monday mornings. And then Monday morning would not be like other Monday mornings at all. She turned off the garage light and went inside. Behind her, in the dark, the Miura sat exactly as it always had, still, unhurried, waiting with the patience of something that already knew how the story ended. Sunday passed the way Victoria had decided it would pass, quietly, on the surface, while underneath it the machinery she'd set in motion continued turning. She spent the morning rereading the financial documents she'd pulled Saturday, this time with a yellow legal pad beside her and a pen that she kept clicking without noticing she was doing it. She was building a chronology, not for herself. She already understood the shape of it, but for the people who would need to act on it Monday morning. Patricia had texted late Saturday night with two names. A forensic accountant named Gerald Fitch, who had done work for 3 separate federal investigations and who charged accordingly, and a litigation attorney named Sonia Baird, who had a specific reputation for corporate fraud cases and who, according to Patricia, had a way of making prosecutors feel like the work was already done for them by the time she walked into a room. Victoria had texted back, both. Monday, 7 a.m. She also, at some point in the middle of the afternoon, received an email from Damian Cross. It was about the client meeting scheduled for Thursday, a small scheduling adjustment, a note about a presentation deck that needed updating before then. She read it twice. His tone was exactly what it always was. That particular blend of efficiency and slight deference that she had always read as professionalism and was now reading as something else entirely. The email was so normal that it required a specific kind of effort to look at. She forwarded it to Renata without responding. Then she called Cole Bennett. He answered on the third ring. She could hear the television in the background. Something with crowd noise. A game of some kind. "Sorry," he said. "1 second." The television sound dropped. "Mrs. Sterling, I wanted to give you a timeline," she said. "Monday morning, I'm bringing in legal and accounting. Depending on how that goes, I want the car running by end of day Monday or Tuesday morning at the latest." A brief pause. "All right. I can be there." "I may need you there for more than the fuse," she said. "I want a full mechanical assessment, everything those specialists touched. I want your honest opinion of what was actually wrong, what they actually fixed, and what they may have made worse." "That's going to take time," he said. "A real assessment on a Miura, going through all of it properly, 2, maybe 3 days." "I'm not in a hurry for the assessment," she said. "I'm in a hurry for the moment the engine starts. The rest can take whatever time it takes." "Understood." A pause. "You doing all right?" She noticed that he asked that again, asked it the same way he'd asked Saturday evening. That's direct, without the social scaffolding most people built around the question to make it easier to deflect. "I didn't sleep much," she said, "but I'm clear." "Clear's good," he said. "Sleep you can catch up on later." She almost said something then. Something about the specific quality of the night, the way the house had felt different with what she now knew living inside it, the way she'd lain awake not from anxiety exactly, but from a kind of restless reckoning with 11 years of a relationship she was having to rebuild from scratch in her memory, fitting new pieces into spaces where other pieces had been. She didn't say any of that. Cole Bennett didn't need it, and she wasn't sure she had the words for it yet anyway. "I'll have Renata confirm the time with you in the morning," she said. "I'll be ready," he said. She ended the call and went back to the legal pad. Monday morning arrived with the specific tension of mornings that have been anticipated too precisely. Victoria was at her desk by 6:15, the coffee Renata had prepared sitting beside her untouched while she went through the weekend's email correspondence one more time, checking for anything that would indicate that Damian Cross had any sense of what was coming. There was nothing. 16 emails over Saturday and Sunday, all routine. One about the Thursday presentation, one forwarding a client inquiry, one that was a reply to something from a colleague in the risk management division about a data filing that needed to be completed by end of quarter. He had sent that one at 10:47 p.m. on Sunday, which was notable only because Cross usually didn't work late on weekends. He had always been particular about his personal time in a way that Victoria had respected, had even admired, thinking it reflected the kind of person who had figured out what mattered. She looked at that email for a long time. 10:47 p.m. Something about it was wrong in a way she couldn't pin down immediately, and then she could. The data filing he'd referenced was for a vendor account that, when she cross-referenced it against the document she'd been reviewing all weekend, was one of the entities she'd flagged for Patricia. He was tidying something. At 10:47 on a Sunday night, he was tidying something he didn't realize she'd already found. She printed the email and added it to the folder. Gerald Fitch arrived at 6:55, 5 minutes early, carrying a soft leather briefcase and looking like a man who had been in a lot of rooms where bad news was being quantified. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had learned to stay neutral while processing things that were not neutral. He shook Victoria's hand, declined coffee, sat across from her desk, and opened his briefcase. "Tell me what you found," he said. "And then let me tell you what you missed." She told him. He listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow pad that was already covered in his own shorthand from whatever preparation he'd done with the documents Patricia had sent him Sunday night. When she finished, he spent a moment looking at his notes. "The overages are the visible layer," he said, "designed to be small enough to avoid scrutiny but structured to accumulate. That's standard." He tapped his pen against the pad. What concerns me more are the vendor entities. The Delaware structure, the registered agents, that's not something you put together casually. That's planning. That's someone who either had legal help setting it up or who knew enough to do it themselves. Cross has a legal background, Victoria said. He practiced briefly before moving into finance. I knew that when I hired him. Fitch nodded slowly. The question I'm going to need answered is how the money moved after it went into those entities. Shell companies receive funds. That's not interesting yet. What happens next is where the story is. Where it goes. How many layers there are between receipt and use, whether it went to individuals or was reinvested or moved offshore. He looked at her directly. I'm going to need full access to everything the operations division touched, not just the Miura file. Everything. You'll have it, she said. Renata will set you up in the conference room. Sonia Baird arrived at 7:10. She was younger than Victoria had expected, mid-40s, with short dark hair and the kind of energy that seemed to compress itself, like a person who had learned to take up exactly the space required and not an inch more. She carried a messenger bag rather than a briefcase, and immediately, upon sitting down, set a small digital recorder on the table. Do you mind? She said. Not at all, Victoria said. Good. I record everything from the initial consultation forward in cases like this. It protects you as much as it protects me. She looked at Victoria with direct, assessing eyes. Patricia told me the broad strokes. I want the details, and I want you to tell me what you want to happen. Not what you think is realistic, but what you actually want. We can negotiate with realistic later. Victoria told her what she wanted. It was, as it turned out, fairly simple. She wanted the money recovered, the people responsible held accountable under the law, and she wanted the structure of how it had been built exposed completely because she believed, and this was the part she hadn't said to anyone yet, that Marcus and Damien were not the only ones, that the scheme had tentacles she hadn't found yet, and that without full exposure, it would simply reconstitute itself somewhere else. Sonia listened to all of it. Then she said, the security footage is significant. An individual entering the garage and removing the component that disabled the vehicle, that's tampering with property. That's a starting point that leads directly to a person, which most financial fraud cases don't have. She paused. You haven't contacted law enforcement yet. No. Good. Don't do that yet. Let Gerald get through the financial records first. When we go to law enforcement, I want to hand them a complete package. Not a theory, not a direction to look in. A package. She picked up her recorder. And Cross is still employed here? He'll be in his office this morning, Victoria said. He has no idea. Sonia nodded. Keep it that way. For now. She glanced at the recorder, then back at Victoria. He's going to figure out that something is wrong at some point. When that happens, the question is whether he runs or whether he comes to you. People like this, experienced, careful, someone who built something over 4 years, they usually don't run. They try to negotiate. She paused. If he comes to you, don't meet with him alone. And if he tries to make an offer of any kind... She stopped, seemed to decide on her words. That would actually help us enormously. Documenting an attempt to obstruct an investigation or purchase silence, that significantly strengthens what we can bring to prosecutors. Victoria thought about that. You're telling me to let him make his move. I'm telling you that if he makes a move, it's evidence, Sonia said. That's all. Armaz. Damien Cross arrived at the office at 8:35, which was his usual time. Victoria watched him come through the lobby on the security feed that Renata had pulled up on a secondary monitor, a small inset in the corner of her screen while she worked. He was wearing his usual Monday suit, carrying his usual coffee from the place on the corner he'd gone to every morning for as long as she could remember. He stopped at the reception desk, said something that made the receptionist laugh. Then he took the elevator to the 4th floor where his office was. Normal. Completely, entirely, seamlessly normal. Victoria turned away from the monitor and went back to the chronology she was building with Fitch. For 3 hours, the office operated as it always did on a Monday morning. Emails circulated, meetings started and ended. The Thursday presentation deck got revised. 2 client calls happened in the ordinary course of things. Victoria attended both of them, said what needed to be said, and returned to the conference room where Fitch had begun laying out the financial records in an order that only he understood, but that he walked her through in 30-minute intervals with a clarity that she found, under the circumstances, genuinely impressive. By 11:30, Fitch had identified 3 additional vendor entities connected to the scheme. The total, at current count, had grown to approximately $3.4 million over 4 years, across 6 separate operational budget lines. Not all of it was definitively stolen. Some was still unclear, pending document review. But the portion that was clear was clear. At 11:57, Renata knocked on the conference room door. "Damien Cross is asking to see you," she said. "He says it's important." Victoria looked at Renata, then at Fitch, then at Sonia, who had come back from a phone call and was now standing near the window with her messenger bag on the chair beside her. Sonia met her eyes and gave one small, almost imperceptible nod. "Tell him I have 15 minutes, Victoria said. "My office. Not here." She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked down the hall. "Sit." He was already in her office when she got there, standing by the window the way he sometimes did when he was waiting, hands in his pockets, looking out at the city the way people look at cities when they're thinking about something else. He turned when she came in and gave her the particular smile she'd seen 1,000 times. Slightly formal, professionally warm. "Victoria," he said, "thanks for making time." "Of course," she said. She sat behind her desk, which put him across from her in the way she preferred. "What's on your mind, Damien?" He sat down in the chair across from her desk and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, a posture she recognized as his version of candid, of "I'm going to level with you." She had watched him deploy it in board meetings for years. She had always trusted it before. "I noticed something this morning," he said. "When I was reviewing the vendor files for Q3 compliance, there are access logs showing that someone pulled the Miura repair records on Saturday. Full file access, including the contract documents." He paused. "I wanted to flag it in case it was a system anomaly, or in case there was something going on I should know about." He had said it carefully, not accusatory, not defensive, just a man flagging something unusual to the person he reported to. Victoria looked at him. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the fuse on the workbench in the evidence bag. She thought about the entry in the security footage at 11:49 p.m. on a Thursday night 4 years ago. Marcus moving through the garage with the specific confidence of someone who knew they belonged there because someone had told them they were safe. "I was reviewing the records myself," she said, evenly. "Personal project. You know how I get when I decide to revisit something?" Something moved across his face. It was gone very fast, less than a second. But she had spent enough years in rooms with people who were managing information to see it. A recalibration, a rapid internal reassessment of what it meant that she had been in those files rather than someone else. "Of course," he said. He sat back slightly. "Anything I can help clarify? Some of those older contracts are organized in a way that probably needs updating. The filing structure from the first couple of years is a bit—" "The filing structure is fine," Victoria said. "I found what I was looking for." Another small silence. Longer this time. "Glad to hear it," Damien said. But the professional warmth in his voice had shifted half a degree, almost imperceptible, the kind of change you wouldn't notice if you weren't already looking for it. "Was there anything specific you wanted to follow up on? I know the Miura's been a difficult situation. I've always felt that we didn't find the right specialist." "We found the right specialist on Saturday," Victoria said. Silence. "A mechanic named Bennett," she said. "He came and looked at the car." Damien Cross was very still. He was a man who was good at being still when he needed to be. She had noticed that before, had filed it under composure, which she had considered a professional virtue. She was filing it differently now. "And?" he said, carefully. "And he diagnosed the problem within the first few minutes," Victoria said. "It's a simple repair. The car is going to be running very soon." She watched him process that. The specific problem, from his perspective, was not that the car was going to run. The specific problem was what running the car would prove, or rather, what it would make obvious by contrast with everything that had preceded it. An engine that starts from a $9 component is an engine that was never broken. An engine that was never broken is 4 years of expert diagnoses that don't hold up. And 4 years of expert diagnoses that don't hold up starts to raise questions about who was directing those diagnoses and where the money was going. He was a smart man. He had always been a smart man. She watched him arrive at the edge of all of that in real time and make a decision. "That's great news," he said. The warmth was back in his voice, steadier now, which was its own tell. It was the warmth of a person who had made a choice and was committed to it. "Really, I know how much that car means to you. I'm glad someone finally figured it out." "So am I," Victoria said. A beat. He stood up. "Well, I won't keep you." He picked up his phone from where he'd set it on the arm of the chair. "If there's anything in those files you want me to walk you through, just say the word. I know the history better than anyone." "I'm sure you do," Victoria said. He gave her the smile one more time, walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Bennett," he said. "What shop does he work out of?" "Small place," Victoria said. "Does good work." He held for a moment, just a fraction of a second too long, the pause of a man deciding whether to push a thing or let it go. Then he nodded and left. Victoria sat very still in her office until she heard the sound of him moving down the hall. Then she took out her phone and sent one word to Sonia Baird. "He knows." Sonia's response came back in 40 seconds. "Good. Watch for the next move." What? The next move came at 2:45 p.m. Victoria was back in the conference room with Fitch when her cell phone buzzed with a call from an unrecognized number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then something. Instinct, the same compass needle that had kept her in her seat long after her official read of a situation was done, made her answer. "Mrs. Sterling." The voice was not one she recognized immediately. Male, measured, with the careful diction of someone who had rehearsed an opening line. "My name is not important at this stage. I'm calling on behalf of someone who believes there may be a way to resolve the current situation to everyone's mutual benefit." Victoria looked across the table at Fitch, who had looked up from his documents. She reached over and turned on her phone's speakerphone capability, then set the phone on the table between them so he could hear. She gave a small gesture toward her bag, where Sonia's business card was visible. He nodded and slipped out of the room. "I see," Victoria said into the phone. Her voice was completely even. "And what situation would that be?" "A misunderstanding, potentially," the man said. "Regarding some financial matters that have been flagged, the individual I represent would like to address those concerns directly and believes that a private resolution, one that protects the company's reputation and avoids the kinds of disruptions that formal proceedings can create, would serve everyone's interests." "A private resolution," Victoria said. "Correct. In good faith, as a demonstration of that intent, the individual in question is prepared to offer a significant gesture, a number. And I want to be clear that this is preliminary, subject to conversation, in the range of $5 million, deposited to any account of your choosing, under any structure that works for you." Sonia came through the door. She had a recorder in her hand and was already pressing the button. She looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the phone. "That's a significant number," Victoria said. "It reflects the seriousness with which my client views this," the man said, "and his genuine desire to make things right in a way that works for everyone." A brief pause. "In exchange, we'd be asking for confirmation that the investigation is concluded, that certain records are handled with appropriate discretion, and that any vehicle currently under assessment be documented as mechanically non-viable." There it was. The full shape of it. All the things the $5 million would be purchasing. Her silence, her complicity in the paperwork, and the permanent silencing of the Miura's engine. The physical evidence of everything that had been done to make it silent in the first place. "I need to think about that," Victoria said. "Of course," the man said. He gave her a number to call back. "We'd like to hear from you by close of business today, if possible. My client is genuinely motivated to resolve this quickly." "I'm sure he is," Victoria said. She ended the call. The conference room was very quiet. Sonia set the recorder down on the table. "That," she said quietly, "is a gift." "Is it enough?" Victoria asked. Solicitation to obstruct an investigation, bribery, witness tampering, before we've even formally opened an investigation. Sonia sat down, pulled her laptop toward her. He called from a clean number, but the content of the call is what matters. Combined with the financial evidence, the security footage, the shell company documentation. Yes. She looked up. It's enough. Fitch, who had been standing near the window listening, said, He panicked. He panicked, Sonia agreed. 4 years of careful, patient work, and he panicked in less than 3 hours because a mechanic from a neighborhood garage found a fuse. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She thought about the $5 million, the size of the number, the confidence it implied, the idea that any number could have been the right number for this particular transaction. She thought about the man on the phone, the careful diction, the rehearsed opening line. She thought about Damien Cross in her office 2 hours ago, asking casually which shop Cole Bennett worked out of. Call Patricia, she said to Sonia. I want law enforcement in the building before end of day. Already composing the message, Sonia said. Tut-tut. Cole Bennett got a call at 3:15 p.m. from Renata while he was in the middle of an oil change for a regular customer who'd had the same truck for 12 years and who always wanted to talk about the weather and the state of the city and whether Cole thought things were generally getting better or generally getting worse. Cole had been giving the same answer to that question for years. Depends on who you ask and what day it is. And it still seemed to satisfy the man. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and stepped outside to take the call. Mrs. Sterling would like you to come tomorrow morning, Renata said. 7 a.m. She's ready for the fuse. I'll be there, Cole said. She also asked me to tell you. Renata paused in a way that suggested she was reading from something. She said to tell you that your instinct about people having moves ready was correct, and that things are moving ahead of schedule. Cole stood in the afternoon light outside the shop. Kellner Street ran in both directions the way it always had. The same storefronts, the same cracks in the sidewalk, the same particular quality of light at this hour that fell between the buildings and made the street look like itself, rather than like something anyone had designed. Tell her I'm glad, he said, and tell her I'll bring the fuse. He went back inside and finished the oil change. His customer wanted to know whether Cole thought things were getting better or worse. Cole gave his usual answer. The man nodded and paid in cash as he always did, and Cole watched the truck pull out into the street and continue on its way. And then he stood at the open bay door for a while, thinking about a car that had been silent for 4 years and what it was going to sound like when it stopped being silent. He thought about $5 million. He didn't know the number was $5 million, but he knew an offer would come, had told Victoria as much on Saturday, and he had a sense of the scale. He thought about what $5 million would do for a shop on Kellner Street. New equipment, the roof that needed fixing, the second bay he'd been trying to afford for 3 years. He thought about those things the way you think about things you've decided against, thoroughly, without pretending the weight of them isn't real, because it was real. The weight of what he'd walked away from by not walking away was real, and the right thing to do and the easy thing to do were occasionally the same thing, but not always, and you had to be clear about which was which. He was clear. He had been clear since the moment he'd looked at that car and understood what he was looking at. Since the moment Victoria Sterling had said someone pulled a fuse with that particular flatness in her voice, the sound of a person who had just had the framework they'd been living inside dismantled in real time. He had been clear since Saturday morning, and the clarity hadn't shifted. He went back to work. There were 2 more cars waiting. By the time he locked up the shop at 6 p.m., the sun had gone sideways through the bay windows and turned the concrete floor the color of old copper, and somewhere across the city, in a building with a lobby that probably cost more to maintain annually than Cole made in 3 years, people were doing things with documents and telephone recordings and the particular machinery of consequence, all of it, everything that had followed, from a fuse that weighed less than an AA battery and cost $8.50 at any part shop within 20 miles. He drove home. He ate what was in the refrigerator, which was not much. He watched the end of something on television without much attention. He thought about the Miura, specifically about the engine, the transverse V12, the particular acoustic character of a 4-liter 12-cylinder at idle, and what it would do to the air in that garage when it caught for the first time in 4 years. There were things in this life that you did because the money was right, or because the situation required it, or because someone needed help and you were in a position to provide it. And then occasionally there were things that you did because the thing itself was worth doing, because some part of you understood, in a way that was prior to reasoning, that this mattered, and that your presence in it was not accidental, and that walking away from it would leave something unfinished that you would feel the edges of for a long time. Cole Bennett was 38 years old and had been working on cars since he was 17. He had fixed a lot of things. He had understood what was wrong when other people hadn't, and he had fixed it and charged a fair rate and moved on to the next one. He did not have illusions about what his work was or what it meant in the larger scale of anything. But tomorrow morning he was going to put a $9 fuse into a 1971 Lamborghini Miura S5, and that engine was going to start, and the sound it made was going to be the sound of the truth. Simple, undeniable, and completely incompatible with 4 years of expensive lies. He set his alarm for 5:30 and went to bed. Cole arrived at 6:53, 7 minutes before he'd said he would, which was how he arrived at most things. Not early enough to make a point of it, just early enough to be ready. The morning was cool and flat, the kind of Tuesday that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. And he came through the side entrance to the garage the same way he had on Saturday, coffee thermos in hand, moving without hurry. Renata met him at the door. She looked like someone who had slept 3 hours, which he suspected was generous. She had the particular composure of a person running on will rather than rest. The eyes clear, but the area around them carrying weight that wasn't there Saturday. "She's inside," Renata said. "They both are." Cole stopped. "Both." "Mrs. Sterling and Mr. Cross." He looked at her for a moment. "Cross is here." "He came in at 6:15, Renata said quietly, "before anyone else. Security let him through because he still has his access card. He went to his office first, then at 6:40 he came down here." She paused. "Mrs. Sterling arrived at 6:30. She's been in the garage since then. She knows he's here. She told me not to call anyone yet." Cole looked at the garage door. Through it he could hear nothing. The building's walls were thick, and the garage's climate control ran quietly. He thought about Sonia Baird's words, "If he comes to you, don't meet with him alone," and about the specific distance between a piece of advice and the reality of a situation when it arrives differently than the advice anticipated. "Is there anyone else in the building?" he said. "The security staff. Gerald Fitch arrived 5 minutes ago. He's in the conference room. Miss Baird is on her way. She's 20 minutes out." Cole nodded once. He pushed through this garage door. The overhead lights were on. The Miura sat in its usual position, the verde metallizzata body catching the artificial light, the way it always did, the color shifting at the curves. Victoria was standing near the driver's side of the car, arms crossed, wearing a gray jacket over dark slacks. She had the look of a person who had made all her decisions before she walked into the room and was now simply executing them. Damian Cross was standing near the workbench. He'd come in his Tuesday suit, navy blue, the one he wore when he had important meetings. She'd noticed that over 11 years without ever particularly noting it until now. He was a tall man, not heavy, with the particular kind of face that reads as trustworthy in a way that has nothing to do with whether the person is trustworthy. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was looking at the Miura with an expression she couldn't fully read. He turned when Cole came in. His eyes went to Cole's thermos, to his flannel jacket, to the toolbox he was carrying, to his face. The assessment was quick and professional. "Mr. Bennett," he said, as if they'd been introduced, as if he'd been expecting him. "Morning," Cole said. He looked at Victoria. She gave him a small nod that meant several things simultaneously, the most immediate of which was, "I'm fine, and I know what I'm doing." Cole set his toolbox on the far end of the workbench and started opening it. He did not look at Cross again. He was here to do a job, and doing the job was the most honest thing he could do in the room. "Damian," Victoria said, "you wanted to talk." "I do." Cross moved away from the workbench, put a few feet between himself and Cole in a way that was probably not conscious but registered as the instinct of someone who wanted a cleaner dynamic. He looked at Victoria directly. "I want to explain some things before this goes further." "Before what goes further?" Victoria said. Before whatever is being built in that conference room goes further. He kept his voice even, almost conversational. I know Gerald Fitch, I know what he does, and I know Sonia Baird by reputation. He paused. I'm not here to run. I'm here because I think there's a conversation worth having. We're having it, Victoria said. Cross looked at her for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something, measuring something. He glanced toward Cole, who had his back to them now, sorting through the contents of his toolbox with methodical attention. Can we? Cross started. Cole stays, Victoria said. Her voice was very flat. Not unfriendly, just finished with that sentence before it got where it was going. Cross accepted that. He took his hands out of his pockets and stood with them at his sides, which made him look slightly more exposed than he'd intended, she thought. The Miura project, he said. I want you to understand how it started. All right, Victoria said. The car broke down. That was real. That wasn't... I didn't plan that. He stopped, seemed to hear how that sounded, and adjusted. Marcus called me when it happened. You'd asked him to manage the immediate response, get someone in to look at it. He called me because that's what he did. He ran things through me when they touched the company budget. A pause. He told me what he'd done, what he'd actually done to the car. He told me that night. Victoria was very still. He came to me because he knew I could protect him, Cross continued. And at the time I told him I wouldn't. I told him to tell you, that we'd figure out a way to handle it, that you'd be angry, but you'd get past it. He stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. And then I thought about it. For about a week I thought about it. And I thought about how much the repair was going to cost regardless, and how many external contractors were going to be involved. And I thought, you thought about the money, Victoria said. Yes, he said. He said it without decoration. I thought about the money. I thought about the structure, how it could be built so that the overages were small enough to not attract attention. I thought about which specialist to bring in, how to make sure the engagement kept going without resolution. He looked at her. I designed it, not Marcus. Marcus pulled the fuse and then he came to me, and I'm the one who turned it into what it became. The garage was very quiet. Cole had stopped moving at the workbench. He was standing still with a small component in his hand, not turning around. The other schemes, Victoria said, the vendor contracts, the 5 other operational budget lines. Cross looked at her steadily. The Miura worked for almost 8 months before anyone considered bringing in additional help. By then I knew the structure held. I knew what the thresholds were, what audit processes would catch, and what they wouldn't. He paused. I'm not going to tell you I regret it from the beginning. I'd be lying. I regret where it went. Where it went, Victoria repeated. $3.4 million, Damien, at current count, and the call yesterday. Something shifted in his face. That wasn't me. It was your attorney. It was an attorney I've used. I didn't authorize that call. He said it with an urgency that was, she thought, probably genuine. I heard about it after. That's why I'm here this morning, actually. Because when I found out about the call, I knew that it had crossed a line I hadn't meant to cross. There were quite a few lines before yesterday's call, Victoria said. I know that, he said. He ran a hand across his face, a gesture she'd seen from him before, usually when he was processing something that was costing him. I know what I built. I know what I'm looking at. I'm not here to negotiate my way out of that. He looked at her directly. I'm here because I think there are things you need to know about what's been happening in the broader portfolio that aren't in those records. Things that Fitch isn't going to find without a direction to look in. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. 11 years, she thought. This was the math of it, the specific, terrible math of long trust, which was that the longer it ran, the more thoroughly it could be used against you. What things? She said. There's a third party, Cross said. Someone outside the company who knew about the structure and used it. Someone who came to me about 18 months in and told me he'd figured out what I was doing and who decided rather than go to you, to leverage it. He paused. I've been paying him for 2.5 years to stay quiet. The room was absolutely still. Who? Victoria said. Cross named a name. Victoria didn't react outwardly, but something in her jaw shifted very slightly. The physical evidence of a person absorbing something that lands harder than the things that came before it. Cole, at the workbench, turned slightly, just enough to register that the information had a particular weight. "That's a significant allegation," Victoria said carefully. "I have documentation," Cross said, "and every payment, the account it went to, the correspondence, most of it encrypted, but the metadata alone is traceable if you know what you're looking for." He paused. "I want to give it to you. All of it. In exchange for... not immunity. I'm not asking for immunity. I know what I did. In exchange for the opportunity to be the one who gives it to you rather than having it come out another way that makes it look like I buried it." Victoria looked at him for a very long time. She was thinking about something Cole had told her on Saturday, that whoever designed this knew her, had built a trap that fit exactly around the shape of what she loved. She was thinking about how long that kind of knowledge takes to accumulate, and what it means to have that kind of knowledge used against you, and what it means to sit across from the person who used it. "You'll give everything to Sonia Baird," she said, "this morning, now." "Yes." "And you'll cooperate fully, everything Fitch needs from you." "Yes." "And you'll understand," she said, and her voice changed slightly. Not louder, not harder, but with a quality she rarely deployed because she rarely needed to. A quality that came from 20 years of building something and knowing exactly what it cost. "That the cooperation doesn't change what I bring to the prosecutors. It may change what they decide to do with it. That's between you and them." Cross was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said. "Good," Victoria said. "Then we're done talking." She looked toward the door that led to the interior of the building. "Renata will take you to the conference room. Sonia Baird will be here in 15 minutes. Cross nodded. He started toward the door and then stopped. He looked back at the Miura, and something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. It wasn't regret, exactly. It was more like recognition. The look of someone seeing something clearly for the first time and finding the clarity not what they'd expected. "It was always going to be something simple, wasn't it?" he said. "Not quite a question." Victoria said nothing. Cross looked at the car for one more second. Then he walked out. The door swung shut behind him. The garage was immediately different without him in it. The air redistributing itself, the particular tension he'd brought with him dissipating in stages. Victoria stood very still for a moment. Then she let out a long breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite anything else. It was just air that needed to go somewhere. Cole turned around from the workbench. He was holding the replacement fuse between two fingers. He looked at her without saying anything, which was, she had learned over the past 72 hours, one of the more valuable things he did. "You all right?" he said. "Ask me again in 10 minutes, she said. Cole looked at the fuse, then at her. "You want to wait for Baird to get here?" "No," Victoria said. She straightened. Something settled in her posture, a decision being made and committed to simultaneously. "No, let's do it now, Chad." Cole pulled the driver's door open and crouched beside the footwell. He'd done this before in his head, walked through it the way he sometimes did with repairs that were simple but that carried weight. Simple repairs were not always easy repairs. Sometimes the simplest thing in the world was the hardest to perform because of everything it meant. He reached under the dash. The fuse box on a 71 Miura SV was not difficult to access if you knew where it was, which Cole did because he'd spent part of Saturday evening in his apartment reading everything he could find about the car's electrical system. Not because he needed to. The fuse socket had been visible to him from the moment he'd looked under there, but because if he was going to be responsible for this car, he wanted to understand it properly. That was how he'd always worked. You didn't fix things you didn't understand. The socket was clean. He'd checked it Saturday and he checked it again now, running a thumb across the contact points. No corrosion. 4 years in a climate-controlled garage had kept everything in a state of suspension, preserved in the exact condition it had been in on the night Marcus walked in with his 2 minutes of deliberate sabotage. Cole seated the fuse. He felt it click into place, precisely, cleanly, the way components fit when they are made to fit and have been waiting for each other. He held his position for a moment, his hand still inside the footwell, and then he withdrew it and stood up and stepped back. He looked at Victoria. She was standing at the rear of the car, near the engine access panel, as if proximity to the V12 would help her hear it better when it caught. Her arms were at her sides now. She looked like someone who had been braced for a long time and was allowing herself, cautiously, to stop bracing. "Try it," Cole said. She walked to the driver's door. She stood beside it for just a moment, long enough that Cole thought she might be going through something private, something that had nothing to do with him and that he had no business watching. So he looked away at the workbench, at the morning light that was starting to come through the narrow windows along the upper wall and lay itself across the garage floor in long, pale strips. He heard the door open, the sound of someone settling into a seat that hadn't held a person in 4 years, a slight creak from the leather, the kind of sound old, beautiful things make when they're being asked to function again. Then Victoria turned the key. The starter motor engaged, a sharp, purposeful sound, the turning of an engine that was being woken up rather than brought back from damage. For a half-second, Cole held himself against the possibility that there was something else wrong, some true mechanical issue buried underneath the false one, some genuine failure that had accumulated in the 4 years of sitting. The V12 caught. It did not catch smoothly. That was the first thing. It stumbled once, coughed once, the way an engine does after a long idle when the fuel system has to push stale fuel out of lines that have been sitting dry. And Cole felt that stumble in his chest in a way that he would not have admitted to anyone. And then the engine found itself and settled into an idle that was rough for about 8 seconds and then became something else entirely. The sound filled the garage. There was no other way to say it. The sound of a V12 at idle in an enclosed space is not a background event. It is a presence, a thing with physical dimension, something you feel in the floor and in your sternum and at the back of your teeth. This particular V12 had a voice that was different from modern engines, different from anything built after emissions regulations and noise standards, had softened the hard edges of what an engine could say about itself. It was raw, and it was even, and it was enormous without being loud, the way truly confident things don't have to be loud. Victoria's hands were on the steering wheel. Cole could see them through the windshield, both hands at 10 and 2, which was not how people normally sat at idle, which was how you sit when you're holding on to something you weren't sure you'd ever hold again. He walked to the driver's side window. She was looking straight ahead at the garage wall. Her eyes were dry, her jaw was set, but something in her face had opened, some arrangement of muscle and expression that had been held in place for a long time by the discipline of managing enormous uncertainty, and that was now, quietly and without performance, coming undone. She didn't cry, but she came close, and the fact that she came close and didn't was, Cole thought, exactly right for who she was. He put his hand on the roof of the car, not thinking about it, just the instinctive gesture of a man who is in the same room as something worth acknowledging. The V12 continued its idle, steady now, even. 12 cylinders in perfect sequence, the way they had been built to be, the way they had been waiting to be. After maybe 2 minutes, Victoria turned the engine off. The silence that followed was a different silence from the one that had been there before. It had the quality of something finished rather than something interrupted. She got out of the car. She stood beside it and put one hand on the roof, next to where Cole's had been. She looked at the car for a moment and then at him. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "That's all it needed?" "That's not what I'm thanking you for," she said. He understood that and nodded once. He picked up his thermos from the workbench and drank from it. The coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. Sonia Baird arrived 17 minutes later and went directly to the conference room where Damian Cross was already seated with his phone on the table and a folder of documents that he'd brought from wherever he'd kept them. Not his office, Cole gathered from the conversation fragments he overheard later, but a personal storage location he'd set up separately from anything connected to the company. The kind of thing a person does when they've been keeping a secret long enough that they've started building escape routes in their sleep. Gerald Fitch, presented with Cross's cooperation and the additional direction he'd provided, spent the next 4 hours working with a focus that made the conference room largely inaccessible to anyone else. Renata brought coffee that she said later nobody touched. Cole spent those 4 hours in the garage. He did the full mechanical assessment Victoria had asked for, going through everything the previous specialist had touched, working methodically from the engine bay out, checking work and components and the quality of decisions made by people who'd been handed an incorrect diagnosis and told to fix it. Some of what he found was competent. Ewan Calloway's electrical work, for instance, had been genuine. There had been aging wiring issues that he'd identified and addressed correctly, even if the issues hadn't been responsible for the car not starting. Calloway had not been wrong, exactly. He'd just been looking in the wrong room. Other work was less impressive. Cole made notes in a small spiral notebook he kept in his toolbox, specific factual notes, the kind that would be useful to a lawyer or an insurance adjuster or anyone else who needed to know the objective state of the car without editorial comment. He also found in the engine bay signs of a repair that had not been done correctly. Theodore Ash's rebuild of the engine section had included replacing a set of seals that ran along the camshaft covers, a reasonable thing to do on a 50-year-old engine regardless of the original problem, but the torque spec on 3 of the fasteners was wrong. Not dangerously wrong, but wrong in a way that would have become a slow oil leak within 6 months of regular driving, which would have required additional work, which would have been another invoice. Cole looked at that for a while. He thought about whether it was an error or a choice. He decided he couldn't know for certain, and so he wrote it down as a factual observation. Fastener torque on camshaft cover fasteners, inconsistent with manufacturer specification at 3 points, and moved on. By noon, the garage smelled like a garage that had been worked in, which was different from how it had smelled since Saturday. There was oil on Cole's hands, and a smear of something on his forearm, and a small cut on his left index finger from a bracket that had a sharper edge than it had any need to have. Victoria came in at 12:15. She looked like a person who had been through something significant and was moving through what came after it on resources that were running lower than she'd let anyone see. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she set one on the workbench near Cole. "Anything?" she asked. He told her what he'd found. She listened the same way she always listened, without interrupting, without reaction that he could read, just receiving the information and arranging it somewhere. "Ash's work," she said. "The torque spec issue. Do you think it was deliberate?" "I can't say for certain either way," Cole said. "Honest answer." She nodded. "Put it in the report regardless." She picked up her coffee. "Fitch found 2 more entities this morning. Cross's cooperation has been comprehensive." She said the word carefully, as if she was still deciding how to hold it. "The third party he named is someone with board-level access at 2 other companies, in addition to this one. Sonia is coordinating with investigators on that separately." Cole looked at her. "You knew the name?" he said. "When he said it in the garage, you knew it." She was quiet for a moment. "I've worked with him for 6 years," she said. "He's on 2 of my charitable boards." She looked at her coffee. "I apparently make a habit of trusting the wrong people at an impressive scale." "You trusted the right mechanic eventually," Cole said. She looked up at him. For a moment, something shifted in her face. Not amusement exactly, but something in its vicinity, the first thing approaching lightness he'd seen from her since Saturday morning. "After 11 tries," she said. 11 is not a bad number," Cole said, "for something this hard." She almost smiled, didn't quite get there, but almost. They stood in companionable silence for a moment. Outside, the day had finally decided to be clear. The flat white sky of the morning had burned off, and the light coming through the upper windows was direct and clean, lying across the garage floor in strips that had gone from pale to gold. "The board meeting is this afternoon," Victoria said. "I'm presenting everything to them at 2. It's going to be—" She stopped, adjusted. "It's going to be a difficult afternoon." "You're ready for it," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "I'm ready for it," she agreed. Then, "I'm also going to recommend that the board authorize a full audit of every operational expenditure over the last 5 years. Not just what Fitch has found. Everything." She paused. "It's going to cost time and money, and it's going to be disruptive, and some of my board members are not going to enjoy the implications." She looked at the Miura. "But the alternative is knowing there might be something I haven't found and choosing to live with that." "You won't choose that," Cole said. "No," she said. "I won't." He went back to work. She stayed for a while, standing near the car with her coffee, not talking, which was fine. Some of the best working silences Cole had experienced were with people who understood that presence didn't require conversation. After a while, she said, Can I ask you something? He looked up from the notebook. Sure. The offer, she said. The call Monday afternoon, $5 million. She looked at him steadily. Did you know one was coming? I thought it would, he said. Why didn't it? She paused, choosing the word. Why didn't it complicate things? For you. Cole thought about that for a moment. He set the notebook down on the workbench. Because the car's not mine, he said, and the truth's not mine to sell. He picked up the notebook again. I'm a mechanic. I found what was wrong. That's the job. What happens around it? The money, the people, all of it. That's not mine to negotiate with. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he was briefly aware of being looked at in a way he wasn't used to. Not romantically, not even personally, exactly. More like being assessed by someone who had spent their professional life assessing things and who rarely encountered something that held up exactly as advertised. You're a strange person, Cole Bennett, she said. I've been told, he said. She finished her coffee and put the empty cup on the workbench and walked toward the door. She paused with her hand on it, the same way she had on Saturday when she'd gone to look at the money. After the board meeting, she said, come have dinner, I owe you that much. You don't owe me anything, he said, but I'll come. She went inside. Cole stood in the garage for a moment after she left. The Miura was 3 feet away from him, engine cold now, exactly as still as it had been for 4 years. Except that the stillness was completely different. Before, it had been the stillness of something stopped. Now it was the stillness of something resting. The distinction was absolute. He picked up his wrench and went back to work. The board meeting lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes, which Cole knew only because Renata sent a brief text to the number she'd saved from the consultation call. Meeting concluded. She's okay. Thank you for being here today. He was finishing the last section of his assessment when the message came through. He read it once and put the phone back in his pocket. The assessment was complete. 41 pages in the spiral notebook, written in the dense technical shorthand that made perfect sense to Cole and that he would translate into a formal written report later, one that could be handed to attorneys or insurers or anyone else who needed to understand what 11 specialists had actually done to this car across 4 years, and how much of it had mattered and how much of it had been motion mistaken for progress. The summary, as he understood it, the car was fundamentally sound. It would need an oil change, new fluids throughout, a check of the brake system that had been sitting idle, and the correction of Ash's torque spec issue. Beyond that, the engine was the engine it had always been. The V12 had not been injured. It had just been silenced, and now it wasn't. Cole packed his toolbox. He wiped down the workbench where he'd worked. He checked the garage floor for anything he'd left, found a shop rag he'd brought from his own truck, picked it up and pocketed it. He stood at the driver's side of the Miura one more time. He looked at the cockpit through the window that he'd cleaned on Saturday. The original leather, the original gauges, the small oval mirror above the instrument cluster. He thought about the 4 years this car had sat here. He thought about what it had cost. Not just the money, though the money was staggering, but the other things. The 4 years of Victoria Sterling going to sleep with an unresolved thing and waking up with it still there. The accumulated weight of wrong answers delivered with total confidence. The specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by experts who can't help you. He thought about his father's shop, which was where he'd learned to work on cars, and the thing his father used to say when Cole was young and impatient and wanted to get to the complicated part of a diagnosis before he'd looked at the simple things. Son, 90% of the time, the simple thing is it. He'd said it enough times that Cole had eventually stopped hearing it as a lesson and started hearing it as just the way things were, the background assumption from which he worked. The simple thing is it. A $9 fuse. Less than 10 minutes of actual hands-on time, if you didn't count Saturday morning's investigation. 4 years of wrong answers built on the assumption that the truth was buried somewhere difficult, when it was right there under the dashboard, in the one place nobody thought to look because they'd all agreed, without saying so, that the answer had to be worth what they were charging to find it. Cole picked up his toolbox and his thermos. He walked to the garage side door and pushed through it into the afternoon. The light outside was clean and direct, the kind of afternoon light that makes the world look like it means something. His truck was parked in the same spot it had been in since Saturday, and it looked exactly like what it was. Old, reliable, through a lot of things, still running. He drove back to Kellner Street. He had work waiting. He had a pickup truck that belonged to a regular customer who needed a new alternator, and an appointment at 3:30 for a brake job that he'd been putting off because the parts had taken longer to arrive than expected. Normal work, the kind that had been there before Saturday and would be there after. He turned onto Kellner Street and pulled into the bay. Inside the shop, exactly as he'd left it, the lights were on and the tools were where they belonged, and the concrete floor smelled of oil and rubber and the specific atmosphere of a working garage. Not glamorous, not climate-controlled, not the kind of place that made people stop and look when they walked through the door. Just a place where things got fixed. Cole hung his jacket on the hook by the door, put his thermos on the workbench, and went to find the parts for the alternator job. The dinner Victoria had promised happened on a Thursday evening, 2 days after the board meeting, in the small dining room off the main kitchen that she used when she wasn't hosting formally. It was not a formal room. It had a round table that seated 6 but usually held stacks of reading material, a window that looked out onto the side garden where nothing much was blooming this time of year, and lighting that was incidental rather than designed. An overhead fixture that gave off warm light without making any particular effort about it. Cole arrived at 7. He'd changed out of his work clothes, which in practice meant he was wearing a different flannel over a clean shirt, and his boots were the same boots, but he'd made an attempt at them with a brush. He'd also brought wine, because his mother had raised him with the specific conviction that you didn't go to someone's house for dinner empty-handed, and the woman at the shop on the corner near his apartment had pointed him toward something she said was good without being presumptuous, which was exactly what he'd asked for. Renata was not there. Victoria opened the door herself and took the wine and looked at the label and said, "This is actually quite good," in a tone that suggested she was genuinely surprised, which Cole took as a fair response. She cooked, which surprised him. Not elaborately, pasta with a sauce that had clearly been going for a while, bread from somewhere that was not her kitchen, a salad that was simple and dressed correctly. She was not a natural cook in the sense of someone for whom it came effortlessly. She had to think about it slightly, had to check a timer once, apologized briefly when the bread was warmer than she'd intended, and then decided not to apologize and said it was fine because it was. They talked about the car through most of the first part of dinner. She had questions about the assessment, technical ones, genuine ones, not the kind of questions people ask to seem interested, but the kind that come from someone who has decided they are going to understand something properly this time, rather than delegating the understanding to someone else. Cole answered all of them. He told her about the camshaft fasteners, about Callaway's wiring work, about the state of the brake system and what it would need before she drove it. She listened and asked follow-up questions, and at some point got up to find a notepad and wrote some of it down. "You don't have to write it down," he said. "I'm sending the full report tomorrow." "I know," she said. "I'm writing it down because I want to know it myself, not just have a document that knows it." He looked at her across the table. "You're going to learn the car," he said. Not a question. "I should have learned it years ago," she said. "If I'd understood what I was looking at when it stopped running, I would have, well, I might have caught it sooner." She set the pen down. "Maybe not. The fuse was designed to be missed, but at least I would have been looking at the right things." "The fuse was designed to be found by someone looking for a mechanical failure," Cole said, which is what everyone expected. The design was in the assumption, not in the hiding place. She was quiet for a moment. "That's what makes it effective," she said. "You don't need to hide something if you can control where people look." They sat with that for a moment. It applied to more than fuses, and it applied to more than the Miura, and they both knew it, but neither of them pushed it further because it didn't need to be pushed. She poured more wine. He accepted, though he wasn't much of a wine drinker usually, and the glass he had would probably be the extent of it. "Damien's attorney called this afternoon," she said. It came out the way she said most things, direct, without wind-up, to discuss the terms of his cooperation agreement. "How's that going?" "He's giving them everything," she said. "More than I expected, honestly. The third party, yes, The one he named in the garage turns out to be connected to three other matters that investigators were already looking at separately. Damien's information closes loops they've had open for 2 years. She picked up her wine glass, held it without drinking. Sonia says his sentencing exposure changes significantly based on the quality of cooperation. He's going to work very hard to cooperate at the highest possible quality. And Marcus, Cole asked. Marcus retained counsel the same day law enforcement was notified, she said. He's not cooperating. He's contesting the charges. His attorney put out a statement yesterday suggesting that the evidence is circumstantial. She set the glass down. Security footage of him entering the garage and removing a component from the car at midnight is going to be difficult to characterize as circumstantial, but that's his attorney's problem to solve. Cole nodded. He was quiet for a moment. What about the specialists? The 11 people who billed you for work on the car? Victoria considered it. Fitch has gone through all of them. The picture is uneven. Some of them were clearly just incompetent in the specific way that happens when you put someone in front of a problem they've been told is deeply complex and they start looking for complexity where there isn't any. Some of them charged fairly for work that was genuine, even if it didn't address the actual problem. She paused. 2 of them, Ash's one, appear to have had contact with Damien's attorney outside the normal engagement channels. Whether that rises to something actionable, Sonia's still working through. And the money, Cole said. Can you get it back? Some of it, she said. The shell company assets are being frozen. There's money that moved offshore that will take longer to recover, if it's recoverable at all. The board authorized the full audit I recommended. That's going to take months, but by the end of it, we'll know the complete picture. She looked at her plate for a moment. The $3.4 million that Fitch confirmed, most of that will come back one way or another. The broader losses from 4 years of mismanagement in the operational budget. She stopped. That's a harder accounting. You'll make it back, Cole said. She looked up at him. Yes, she said. That part I'm not worried about. I know how to make money. I've always known how to make money. She was quiet for a moment. What I'm less certain about is the people part. Building back a version of this company that I actually trust. She said it evenly, without self-pity, the way she said most things. 11 years with Damien Cross. 6 years with the board member he named. Those aren't calculations I got slightly wrong. Those are relationships I built on incomplete information, and I'm the one who decided the information was complete enough. But Cole thought about that. He thought about saying something useful, and then thought that what he had to say might not be as useful as just letting her say the things she was actually saying. I'm good at reading financials, Victoria continued. I am genuinely good at that. I can look at a balance sheet and feel the lie in it before I find it. I've done it 100 times. She picked up her fork, set it back down. Apparently, I am considerably less good at reading people I've decided to trust. The decision seems to insulate them somehow from the same scrutiny I'd give anything else. That's not a character flaw, Cole said. She looked at him. That's just how trust works, he said. If you applied the same scrutiny to people you trusted as to people you didn't, you'd never trust anyone. The trust is the thing that drops the scrutiny. That's what it is. He paused. The people who used it against you understood that. They counted on it specifically. That's a generous interpretation, she said. It's an accurate one, he said. Generous would be pretending it didn't cost you anything. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the side garden was dark, nothing visible through the glass except the reflection of the room back at itself. The table, the light, the 2 of them sitting across from each other. My father, she said. It came out slightly differently from the rest, less managed. The car. I bought it the week after he died. I've never told anyone that. She looked at the window. He had a photograph of a Miura on his office wall his whole life. He couldn't afford one. He just liked knowing that something that beautiful existed. She paused. I could afford one, so I bought it. And I don't know if that was for him or for me, or just because money makes it possible to do things that are really about something else entirely. And I had the money. Cole said nothing, waited. When it stopped running, she said, it felt like losing something twice, which is not a rational response to a mechanical failure. It's not even a rational response when the mechanical failure turns out to not be a mechanical failure. She picked up her wine glass. But feelings are not in the habit of waiting for the facts. No, Cole said. They're not. She drank. Set the glass down. Anyway, she said, and the word carried the particular weight of someone deciding to step back from the territory they've just walked into. You didn't come for that. I don't mind it, he said, and he meant it. He was not a man who was comfortable with most conversations. He'd always been better with things than with people, better with the physical language of machines than with the social language of rooms. But this particular kind of conversation, the kind where a person just said what was true, he could manage. She looked at him for a moment. You're easier to talk to than you seem like you'd be, she said. I've been told that too, he said. She almost smiled, got further this time than she had in the garage. They finished dinner and she cleared the plates and he helped, which she didn't ask for but also didn't object to, and they ended up standing in the kitchen with cups of coffee that were better than what he made at the shop, which was a low bar, and she brought up the formal assessment report. And when she could expect it, and he told her Friday, and she said that worked. Then she said, I want to talk to you about something else. He waited. The collection, she said. I have 9 other cars. The Miura is the centerpiece, but there are others. 2 more Italians, a pair of pre-war British cars, some Americans from the 50s and 60s. They've been managed by a rotation of specialists, none of whom I've ever particularly trusted, but whom I've kept because the alternative was finding someone new. She looked at him steadily. I'd like you to manage the collection. Full mechanical oversight, ongoing maintenance, assessments, recommendations on acquisitions or disposals. It would mean a significant expansion from what you're doing now, and I'd make it worth your while in terms of— No, Cole said. She stopped. You didn't let me finish. You were going to tell me a number, he said, or a title, something significant, and I appreciate it, I mean that. He held his coffee cup in both hands. But no. She looked at him for a moment. Not offended, she was not easily offended, but genuinely trying to understand. Why? Cole thought about how to say it. He was not a man who had a ready vocabulary for this kind of conversation, for the explaining of choices that were mostly made before they were examined. I have a shop on Kellner Street, he said. I've had it for 8 years. Before that I worked for my father in his shop, which is the shop I learned in, which is where I got everything I know about how to do this. He paused. The people who come to me, they're not bringing Lamborghinis. They're bringing trucks that are 10 years old and have to last another 10. Family cars. The thing somebody's grandmother drives to her appointments. The kind of vehicle where if it doesn't run, something real doesn't happen. Somebody doesn't get to work. Somebody can't get the kid to school. He set the coffee cup down. I know how to work on a Miura. I knew when I walked through your door, but that's not— He stopped, finding the word. That's not what I'm for. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him in the particular way she had, receiving, assessing, without reaction she hadn't chosen to show. What you're for, she said slowly. You've thought about this. I think about it the same way everyone thinks about their work, he said. The same way you think about yours. Not philosophically, just, this is what I do, and the why of it is in the doing of it. He paused. Your collection deserves someone who wants to take care of your collection. That person exists. I'll help you find them if you want, but it's not me. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. One slow, deliberate nod. Not defeat, not disappointment exactly, but the motion of a person who has been given an honest answer and is deciding to respect it. All right, she said. I'll take you up on the offer to help find someone. Good, he said. I know a few people. She picked up her coffee cup. There was a small silence in the kitchen that had the quality of something comfortable rather than something that needed to be filled. I want to ask you one more thing, she said. Go ahead. When you walked into the garage Saturday morning and looked at the car. She paused. What did you actually see in those first minutes? Walk me through it the way you would have thought it. Cole looked at the counter, organized it. Car looked too good, he said. That's the first thing. A car that has a real mechanical failure, especially something that grounds it completely. It shows it. The history of being worked on shows. Tools leave marks, things get scratched, the interior gets disturbed. A car goes through 11 repair engagements over 4 years. It should look like it's been through something. He paused. The Miura looked like it was waiting, like somebody parked it carefully and left. And then? The dust on the interior surfaces was even, he said, consistent everywhere, meaning nothing had been disturbed inside the cabin. Nobody had gone under the dash looking for anything, which means all those specialists went straight to the engine and never came back to the cockpit. He paused. 11 specialists, and not one of them looked under the dashboard. Because they had no reason to, Victoria said. They were told it was a mechanical failure. Right. And the assumption hardened each time somebody else confirmed it. By the time the 8th specialist came through, the diagnosis was established. Nobody was starting from scratch anymore. They were all inheriting somebody else's framework and working inside it. He drank the last of his coffee. I didn't inherit the framework. I walked in without one. That's what made the difference, she said. Partly, he said. Partly, it's just, I looked in the right place. Any of them could have. The socket was right there. He was quiet for a moment. The hardest thing to do sometimes is to act like you don't already know the answer, to really look at a thing the way you'd look at it if you had no idea what was wrong. Victoria set her cup down on the counter. She was looking at something in the middle distance, not at him. The look of someone who is taking something and fitting it against something else they know. That's not a mechanic's lesson, she said. No, Cole said. It isn't. Assume. The legal proceedings moved at the pace that legal proceedings move, which is to say, not fast but forward. Damian Cross entered a formal cooperation agreement within 2 weeks of that Tuesday morning. His information was, as Sonia had assessed, genuinely useful, the kind that gets prosecutors to the end of something they've been circling for a long time. In exchange, his exposure was reduced, though not eliminated. He would serve time. The amount would be determined by a judge who would weigh 11 years of careful theft against 2 weeks of comprehensive honesty and arrive at a number that would satisfy no one entirely, which is generally how justice works. Marcus Henley's case moved differently. His attorney's strategy of contesting the evidence ran into the security footage with the particular inflexibility of things that are simply, physically, there. He entered a guilty plea 4 months after the Tuesday morning, on the advice of counsel, and without any visible display of the remorse that his plea statement technically contained. He would also serve time. The third party, the board member Cross had named, proved to be the most complex matter. His connection to the 2 separate ongoing investigations meant that his case became part of something larger, handled by people with wider authority than Sonia Baird, though Sonia remained involved in the Sterling Capital-specific portions. He was ultimately charged across 3 jurisdictions. The resolution of that took the better part of a year and resulted in consequences significant enough that his name appeared in the financial press, in a context his lawyers had spent considerable energy trying to prevent. Gerald Fitch completed the full audit of Sterling Capital Group's operational expenditures over 5 years. It took 4 months and the work of 8 people and produced a report that ran to 312 pages plus appendices. The confirmed diversion across all schemes totaled $4.1 million. Approximately $2.6 million of that was ultimately recovered through asset freezes, civil judgments, and the cooperative return of funds by parties who preferred civil resolution to criminal exposure. The remainder, roughly $1.5 million, was, as Fitch had told her it might be, gone in the way that money gets gone when it has had enough time and enough layers to become difficult to follow. Victoria absorbed all of it. She reported all of it to her board, to her clients, and to the regulatory bodies that had jurisdiction over a firm of her size and type. The disclosure was not legally required in all its particulars. She did it anyway, because the alternative was knowing she'd left something partial in a place where people trusted her for completeness, and that was a thing she found she could not do. 3 clients left. They did so politely, and she did not try to stop them. 16 others, some of whom she had expected to leave, stayed, and several of them specifically cited the disclosure as the reason. One wrote her a letter by hand, which almost no one did anymore, saying that in 20 years of working with financial managers, she had encountered very few who told the truth when they didn't have to. Victoria read the letter twice and kept it. The reconstruction of her company's internal oversight structure took longer than the legal proceedings. She brought in new people, not uniformly young or inexperienced, but uniformly chosen by a method she had not used before, which was that she assigned the selection process to an outside firm and reviewed their work rather than making the choices herself. She did not trust her own instincts for people the way she had before, not fully, and the intelligent response to a calibration error was not to pretend it hadn't happened. It was to build different checks. She did. Renata stayed. Philip the driver stayed. Gerald Fitch became the company's external audit oversight on a retained basis, which was an unusual arrangement, but one that made sense to people who understood the context. Patricia Owens, who had always handled the company's legal work, took on an expanded role in internal compliance. Sonia Baird finished her formal engagement and sent a final bill that was very large and entirely justified. Cole sent the formal written assessment report on Friday, as promised. It was 28 pages, typed in the evenings over 2 days, in the same precise language he used for all his professional documents. Specific, factual, without flourish. Victoria read it that weekend and sent a single reply. "This is exactly what I needed. Thank you." He came back to the estate once more, 3 weeks later, to oversee the final work on the Miura before she drove it. The brake system needed the attention he'd flagged in the assessment, and the camshaft fasteners needed to be corrected properly, and there were a few other items, fluid replacements, a belt that was at the edge of its service life, that added up to a day and a half of careful work. He brought a colleague from his shop, a younger mechanic named Joel, who had good hands and who Cole had been teaching for 2 years, because the job was easier with 2 people, and because Joel had never been this close to a car like this, and Cole thought it was worth letting him see one. Joel walked around the Miura for a full 5 minutes before touching it. He didn't say much. He just looked. "This is what they were actually building for in the 60s, Joel said eventually. "Some of it," Cole said. "Come look at the engine bay." Victoria came out to the garage partway through the second day. She brought coffee and stayed for a while, asking questions, not just of Cole, but of Joel, too, which Joel was not expecting and handled by becoming briefly tongue-tied and then finding his footing. She had a way of asking questions that made people want to answer carefully, Cole had noticed. She listened in a way that made you mean what you said. When they were done, Cole drove the Miura a mile down the private road and back. He was methodical about it. Not the kind of drive that was about the experience, but the kind that was about the data. Feeling for anything that wasn't right, listening for anything that shouldn't be there. It drove the way it should drive. The engine pulled cleanly. The suspension did what it was supposed to do. There was a slight hesitation in second gear that might need attention eventually, but that was within normal range for a vehicle of this age and mileage. He came back and told Victoria all of it. She listened and nodded and wrote one thing down. Then she said, "I'm going to drive it tomorrow morning." "You should," Cole said. "By myself," she said. "Early, before anyone's on the road." "That's the right way to do it," he said. She looked at the car. "Will you be here?" He thought about it. "If you want." "I think I do," she said. Then, after a moment, "Not to watch, just to be around." "All right," he said. The next morning was clear and cold in the way that particular season sometimes produced. The kind of cold that had no meanness in it, just clarity. Cole arrived at 6:15. The estate was quiet, the ground still. He parked and went to the garage and opened it and checked a few things. Tire pressure, oil level, nothing he hadn't checked yesterday, just the habit of someone who looks at things properly rather than assuming they stayed the same overnight. Victoria came out at 6:30. She was dressed for cold, jacket, scarf, the practical version of herself rather than the professional one. She was carrying her coffee and the travel cup she probably used on mornings that weren't about impressing anyone. She walked into the garage and looked at the car for a moment. Then she opened the door and got in. Cole sat on the wooden stool in the corner, the same one he'd found on that first Saturday, and drank his coffee and waited. He heard the engine start. Cleaner this time than the first time, no stumble, the fuel system fully reprime after several warm-up cycles. The V12 settled into its idle. even and full and absolutely certain of itself. Victoria let it warm up for 3 minutes. Cole could see her through the windshield sets, sitting there with both hands on the wheel, not doing anything else, just being in the presence of the sound. Then she put it in gear and drove it out of the garage and down the private road. He heard the engine note change as she accelerated, the pitch rising and deepening simultaneously in the way that only a displacement this large can manage, the sound of 12 cylinders at load spreading across the clear morning like something being announced. It went down the road. He listened to it get smaller and farther and then disappear around the curve beyond the tree line. And then he sat in the quiet garage and drank his coffee and did not think about very much. Just sat. The way you sit when something that has been unresolved for a long time has finally resolved. And the resolution is not dramatic now that it's here, it's just the ordinary silence that follows when the noise stops. It was about 12 minutes before he heard the engine coming back. The pitch dropping as she slowed, the V12 pulling down through its range, and then the car came back through the gap in the tree line and down the last stretch of road and into the garage, and Victoria turned the engine off. She sat in it for a moment. Then she got out. She looked like someone who had been through the forward edge of a feeling and come back out the other side. Not transformed. Victoria Sterling was not the kind of person who got transformed, but something had settled in her. Whatever weight had been attached to this car and what it represented, she had taken it for a drive and brought it back, and the bringing back was its own kind of answer. She walked over to where Cole was sitting. She stood beside him looking at the mirror. "He would have loved that," she said. Her father. She didn't say it, but Cole understood. "Yeah," he said. "I think he would have." They stood there for a moment. The car ticked quietly as the engine cooled. Outside, the sun was fully up now, the light direct and specific, making everything look like itself. "I keep thinking about what you said," Victoria said, "about looking at a thing without already knowing the answer." "It's easier said," Cole said. "I know, but I keep thinking about it in other contexts." She paused. "The people I brought in after Damien, I've been looking at them differently. Not with distrust, just actually looking, rather than deciding first and seeing what I need to see." "How's that going?" "Slower," she said. "It's going slower, but I think it's more accurate." Cole nodded. He believed that. In his experience, the things that went slower because you were doing them right were the only ones that held. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly rather than diplomatically." "That's the only way I know," he said. "The day you sat with the car," she said, "before you started, those first 4 minutes, were you certain, or did you have a suspicion that you were willing to follow?" Cole thought about it. He gave it the genuine consideration it deserved rather than reaching for the easy answer. "A suspicion," he said. "Educated, based on what I was seeing, but I didn't know until I looked under the dash." He paused. "I've been wrong before. I've walked into a job thinking I knew what it was and found out I was completely off. The difference is, I try not to decide before I look. I try to make the looking come first." "The looking come first," she repeated. "The deciding is easy," he said. "Anybody can decide. Looking takes longer and it's less comfortable because you might find something you didn't expect." He drank the last of his coffee. "Most of the time, though, what you find is just the truth. And the truth is almost always simpler than the story you were telling about it." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She looked at the Miura, at the verde metallizzata body in the morning light, the color deepening around the curves the way it always did. She had driven it now. She would drive it again. It was her car again, in a way it hadn't been for 4 years. Not a problem, not an emblem of defeat, not the center of an expensive unresolved wound. Just her car. Beautiful. 50-plus years old, running exactly as it should, a $9 fuse, less than $2 million worth of wrong answers, one mechanic who walked in without a framework. "Thank you, Cole," she said. He stood up from the stool and picked up his thermos. "I'll leave the name of the collection manager I mentioned," he said. "He's in the city. He's done good work for people I trust." "I'll call him," she said. He walked toward the side door, paused with his hand on it. "Drive it more," he said. "Not for any particular reason, just, it's a car. Cars are supposed to be driven. I know, she said. I will. He pushed through the door and walked to his truck in the morning light. He sat in it for a moment before he started it. Through the windshield, the estate looked exactly as it had on that first Saturday. The kind of place built by people who understood what permanence was supposed to look like. Solid, expensive, cared for. He started the truck. It turned over on the first try, the way it always did if you treated it right, and he backed out and drove down the long approach to the private gate and out onto the main road. He thought about what he was going back to. The alternator job that was probably waiting, 2 appointments he needed to return calls about. Joel, who would be in early because Joel was always in early, who had good hands and who was getting better every week, and who would probably have his own shop someday if he kept going the way he was going. The particular smell of the shop in the morning, before the work started, oil and rubber and metal and the cold air from outside that came through the bay doors and mixed with the warmth from the space heater in the corner. It wasn't much, as a life. Or it was exactly enough, which might be the same thing depending on how you looked at it. He drove back to Kellner Street. He pulled into the bay. Joel was already there, as expected, working on a car that belonged to a woman who drove 40 minutes each way to her job at a distribution center and who needed the car to last until her youngest finished high school, which was 2 more years. The fix was not complicated. The parts were not expensive. The work mattered completely. Cole hung up his jacket and put his thermos on the workbench and looked at the job board. There were 5 cars waiting. He rolled up his sleeves and went to work.